Good morning. This is the inquest into the disappearance of Theo Hayez. We'll start by asking for appearances.
May it please the Court, my name is Edwards. I appear with leave to assist you with Mr Harrington and Ms McGee of the Crown Solicitor's Office.
Thank you, Ms Edwards.
May it please the Court, my name is Evenden. I appear on behalf of the Hayez family.
Thank you. Mr Evenden.
Your Honour, my name is Palmer. I appear on behalf of the Commissioner of New South Wales Police, as Solicitors Alana Wooldridge and Timothy Lowe also appear with me remotely.
Thank you very much, Ms Palmer. Mr Evenden, I wonder if you'd be able to introduce Theo's family to me?
Certainly, Your Honour. Your Honour...
And you may take your mask off while you're speaking.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Your Honour. Moving from Your Honour's left to right, Theo's father, Laurent, Theo's brother, Luca, Theo's grandmother, Jacqueline, and Theo's mother, Vinciane. And then moving back from right to left, we have Matthew, who is Lisa's partner, Lisa Hayez, Theo's cousin, Julia, who is JP's wife, and finally Jean-Philippe Pector, or JP.
Yes, thank you. I'm so pleased that you were all able to be here and to travel a long distance to be here. I feel like I'm very lucky that you managed to get here when you did. I also know that the Byron Bay community will be very happy that you're here and that they can continue to support you in the way that they have been. And I know it's going to be probably a tough 2 weeks, but I just wish you and all of us all the best as we do the best we can for Theo over the next 2 weeks together.
Thank you.
Before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation. I would like to acknowledge the elders and ancestors of this country and their ongoing connection to land, skies and waterways. I pay my respects to the community and to all Aboriginal people joining us today. I'll now ask my counsel assisting, Ms Edwards, to present the opening.
Thank you, Your Honour. On behalf of the assisting team, we would also like to acknowledge the Arakwal peoples of the Bundjalung Nation. Like Your Honour, we too acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians and their continuing connection to land, culture and community. We also acknowledge and welcome Theo's family, many of whom have travelled from Belgium to Australia in what can only be described as trying international circumstances. And they will be assisted today by an interpreter, and I'll try and be respectful of that process. Your Honour, Theo's family have been so consistent and gracious throughout the coronial investigation, and they will continue to be this week. What I'm going to do today, Your Honour, is quite a lengthy opening. It could take about 2 hours. We will be seeing a lot of audio-visual material, particularly pictures, CCTV footage and maps. I'm going to start with an overview that's quite quick of the key facts, and then we'll go into it in a lot more detail. There'll be at least 2 breaks. I can also let parties know that a written version of this will be distributed, so there's no need to take detailed notes during the opening. As I can also indicate that with the gracious acknowledgement of Theo's family, I'm going to call him Theo, not Theo, which is his name, and I apologise for my inadequacies in that respect. Your Honour, Theo was reported missing to police by his family on Thursday the 6th of June 2019. He was just 18, he was from Belgium, and he was coming to the end of a backpacking trip around Australia. He arrived in Byron Bay on Wednesday, the 29th of May 2019. He was booked to stay until the following Wednesday, the 5th of June. Theo went missing on the Friday night, the 31st of May. So he arrived on the Wednesday, he went missing on the Friday night. after leaving a bar called Cheeky Monkeys at 11:03 p.m. This is footage of Theo when he's walking in to Cheeky Monkeys. As Your Honour can see, he was wearing a grey Puma cap, a black hoodie with a pattern on the chest, black shoes. He was wearing a necklace, possibly a black watch. He had a black wallet and he had a purple Oppo brand phone. Theo's phone has never been found, but his Google account, which was uncovered by his family, has provided a digital data trail. This shows that after leaving Cheeky Monkeys, Theo searched Google Maps for directions back to Wake-Up Hostel, but he didn't follow those directions. Instead, he walked in the opposite direction to Tallows Beach. The map on the screen, Your Honour, is an aerial overview of Byron Bay. Your Honour can see in the middle of that map there's Cheeky Monkeys, which is located with that Cheeky Monkeys is indicated with that purple marker, and that's right in the centre of Byron Bay on Johnson Street. On the far left-hand corner, Your Honour can see the Wake-Up Hostel at Byron Bay, which is on Child Street at Belongal Beach, and then Your Honour can see to the right, Tallows Beach. The yellow pins are activity that's been logged by Google on Theo's phone, and that's how we know the route that he took after leaving Cheeky Monkeys. Your Honour can see the route that he took to Tallows by following those yellow pins, and one can see there that if one was standing facing the beach with Cheeky Monkeys to your right, Wake Up is on the left, Tallows Beach is on the right, so it's almost in exactly the opposite direction. The last reliable and clear data point is the red pin. That places Theo's phone at Cosy Corner near the Cape Byron cliffs. The location services for Theo's phone were turned off at 12:05 a.m. on the 1st of June 2019, so that's in the very early hours of the Saturday night. That was probably done by Theo to save battery life. But we know that Theo sent messages to his friends and family before and after he turned off his location services. Those messages were light-hearted and they were in French, which suggests both that he had possession of his phone and that he felt safe. The last message was sent to his stepsister Emma at 12:55 a.m. The working theory of the police is that Theo tried to climb the cliffs near Cosy Corner, fell and was swept out to sea. There has been no recovery of any remains, nor of any of Theo's clothing or possessions from that night, except for his Puma cap that was located some weeks after he disappeared on the 7th of July 2019 in bushland on the route that he took to Tallows Beach. Maybe we might even just show Your Honour the location where his cap was found on that route. That's the red pin, and Your Honour will see location of Puma cap on the map. If the police working theory is correct and Theo fell into the water, his phone didn't go with him because it was still working and transmitting data until about 1:47 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday the 1st of June 2019. But mysteriously, the phone stopped transmitting data. It stopped between 1:02 a.m. and then it came back on at 6:17 a.m. It remained on, but with a very weak signal, until just after 1:47 p.m. That phone has never been located. There have been a number of unconfirmed sightings of Theo since he disappeared on the 1st of June. Some are more credible than others. But Theo did not make any contact with his family or friends after that date, the 1st. He didn't make any bank transactions, and there is strong reason to believe that he would not deliberately disappear, particularly given his strong and close connection to his family, his friends, his loved ones. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about the events leading to Theo's disappearance and what we might be able to draw from the phone data, but I want to start by telling Your Honour a bit more about Theo. That's an important part of any inquest, but in this case it's also part of the evidence of this inquest because his character and personality is very significant in trying to interpret and draw inferences from what we see here today. Your Honour, it could be said that Theo was a family guy. He was close to his parents, Laurent and Vinciane, and we know that they've come all the way here for this inquest, his brother Luca, and his step-family. His phone records show that he kept in almost constant contact with his family. He regularly exchanged light-hearted messages with Luca, and I think they had video calls, and with Emma, his stepsister. He contacted his mother almost every day, usually through Facebook Messenger. He sent postcards to his great-grandmother, and he sent emails to his grandmother. He was also close to his godfather, or parrain, Jean-Philippe Pector, who everybody knows as JP. Your Honour, I cannot underestimate the contribution that JP has made to this investigation over the last 2 years. He's been a driving force, a force of nature, and a passionate advocate for Theo and his family. He's also personally responsible for some of the evidence we're going to hear this week. The plan was that JP would be a bookend, that Theo would start his trip with him and Theo would end his trip with JP, with his family in Victoria. Theo was then going to fly to Belgium, where he was going to start studying for exams for his planned engineering degree. The evidence suggests Theo was both excited and a little bit nervous because it was going to be a lot of work. He comes across in all the evidence as a funny and adventurous young man. In fact, we spoke to all the backpackers he met, and every single one of them said he was funny. It was just the word that came out every single time. But he had a serious side. He was very politically engaged. He was an intellectual person. He had an interest in European politics, and he was passionate about the environment. And what Theo's family tell us is his passion for the environment was personal and political. He loved being in nature, he loved being around nature, and he wanted to protect nature. And so that was something that was a driving force for him. Technically, he was travelling alone in the sense that he left alone and was returning alone, but he wasn't alone for much on his travels. He made friends along the way and they would go off on side trips, but he also went on group tours. He had a private Instagram account and he used that to post photos of his travels around Australia. During his travels, he visited, and I'll just reel this off quickly, Tasmania, the Whitsundays, Fraser Island, Noosa, Townsville, Cairns, Alice Springs and Uluru, Darwin and Kakadu and Litchfield National Park. And as Your Honour would know, these are some of the greatest places in Australia, but they're also places that tourists go to a lot. And JP is going to tell us tomorrow that Theo wanted to sort of stick to the traditional backpacker route. That was where he felt comfortable. Theo had a lot of friends back in Europe and he kept in contact with them regularly as well. He used email, Instagram Messenger, Snapchat, Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp to variously communicate and send photos of his trip. And what's there, Your Honour, is the two handles for Theo's private Instagram accounts. We don't have the messages on those accounts, but that's his handle. Theo also had family who were based in Australia, and Lisa is here today. And Theo spent a lot of time with them and also arranged his trip around seeing them. So he lived with Lisa for a month in Melbourne in January, and they had a job working at the Australian Open. He also spent New Year's Eve with Lisa in Sydney, and that's a picture of Theo on the far right with Lisa with Sydney in the backdrop on New Year's Eve. And I just indicate there that Theo's hair's quite short there. He let it go during his trip until it was down on his shoulders by May. Almost all the evidence is to the effect that Theo had a great time on his Australian adventure, but also he was ready to go back and he was looking forward to starting the next phase of his life. When he was in Byron, he was texting his stepsister Emma about a reunion party that he was going to have with his friends when he got back. He told his mother that he was counting the days until his return, but he also told his father that some of the greatest experiences of his life had been on the trip. Your Honour, there's just no evidence at all that would suggest that Theo would commit suicide. He wasn't depressed. He had no known mental health issues. He was in contact with close friends that he could have proper conversations with and confide in, and he had no known troubles legally, personally or financially. As Your Honour can see, Your Honour was strong and fit. He liked walking and hiking and mountain biking. Like many young backpackers, he tried surfing while he was here in Noosa, and he had a real knack for it, and he was going to try that again. I think he told Lisa he was going to do it at the Gold Coast. I think he also told his mother he was going to show off his skills in France. He could swim, but he wasn't an experienced ocean swimmer. He liked taking photographs, including of scenery and natural landscapes, and he had a digital camera, but he wasn't a photo buff in the sense that he had specialised equipment or would always be obsessed with getting the next perfect shot. He was a good navigator. He was good at using Google Maps, and for reasons I'll explain, it's a very important fact in this case. He had experience in camping, but there's no evidence that he had particular bush skills or survival skills or would sleep for days in the bush without shelter. Theo's mother tells us he didn't like the cold, so she wouldn't see him sleeping for days outside or anything like that. Your Honour, he comes across, particularly in the evidence from his family, as a cautious guy, particularly a cautious guy for 18. Theo had a habit, and we've looked at his phone data and we've seen this habit. He liked to look up on a map, on Google Maps, where he was most of the time, just to keep track. So when he's moving around, he tends to keep track of where he is on Google Maps. Theo was up for new experiences, but not really winging it. He was careful with money, and his spending throughout his trip was carefully judged to make his money go further. He liked to be organised and prepared, and I think we're going to hear this week some illustrations from his friends and family about how he always liked to be organised and prepared. He didn't have any history of aggression or getting into fights, and he wasn't an aggressive person. His family and friends think he would only engage in physical confrontation if it was to defend himself, because he needed to, or to defend someone else. Theo's family also don't think, given his cautious personality, that he was likely to engage with many strangers or to do something reckless, and in particular like climbing an unfamiliar cliff when it was very dark. They think that if he engaged with anyone that night, it was likely to be someone who looked like a fellow traveller or someone like that who seemed unthreatening and like him. Your Honour, I know that people could be sceptical and say, well, families might only see a certain side of their family member and a young man, but there's a lot of other evidence in this case. Investigators have examined his journal, all his SIM data, including his social media accounts, and police and those assisting have conducted numerous witness interviews. There is nothing in that evidence that suggests that Theo was reckless, that he liked to engage in dangerous physical activity, that he was aggressive, that he was a big drinker, or that he had much or really any interest in using illicit drugs. We can't categorically rule any of those things out, but we haven't found any evidence to suggest those things in his character. I'm going to come now to Theo's trip, and in particular what happened just before he went missing in Byron Bay. And I'm going to start on the 25th of May when Theo was in Brisbane, and he spent the night with his cousins Lisa Hayez and Michael Dorcombe. They'll be the first witnesses tomorrow. They've also played a very active role in searching for Theo, and they made some very crucial discoveries of evidence. On the 25th of May, they had a lovely night. They were catching up with Theo. They talked about his trip, and they caught up on his travels. Theo was in good spirits and looking forward to the next stage of his journey. The next morning, which was the 26th, Michael and Lisa dropped Theo at the bus terminal. He was going to catch a Greyhound bus from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, stay at the Gold Coast, and then move on to Byron Bay. Those assisting Your Honour and the police have tried to find out more about what he was doing at the Gold Coast, but we haven't been able to uncover anything. We know that he was staying at a hostel called Nomads, but that's all we've been able to uncover. Theo arrived in Byron Bay on a Greyhound bus on the Wednesday the 29th of May. He got in at about 2 p.m. He checked in and he paid in full to Monday the 3rd of June. So Your Honour might recall I said he was booked up until the Wednesday. So his bus to Melbourne left on the 5th of June, but he only paid up until Monday the 3rd of June at Wake Up. He was given an electronic access key to get into his room, and we don't know whether he kept it on a lanyard around his neck, like some of the travellers, or whether he kept it in a pocket or in his wallet. It's never been found. The staff had a practice of showing guests where the Byron Township was on a map and marking it out, and this is the map that was found in Theo's possession. I think Your Honour's going to be told by the people at Wake Up that they would tell travellers that if they wanted to get into Byron, they should walk along the beach and then cut down to get onto Johnson Street. So to walk down Balongal Beach, main beach, and then turn right to get onto that road on Johnson Street. That took about 20 minutes. The hostel also had shuttle buses, and they left to go to town every half hour. Theo checked into a dorm at Wake Up. It was this one. It's like an A-frame, it's like a mini house, Your Honour. It houses 8 people, but it's self-contained with those 8 people. It was right at the back of the property, and the property backs onto bush, which is quite swampy. We're going to go there today, Your Honour, and we'll see where Theo stayed. I'll show you a photo of his room. He was in the entrance room that one would see when one walked in. He was on the top bunk, and a traveller called Nick was on the bottom bunk. And if move on to the next photos, most of the people in Theo's little house already knew each other, and that might have meant that he felt a bit hard to connect with them because they already knew each other from previous travels. We're going to talk to or hear evidence from Beth Clark on Wednesday. She was travelling with her friend Ryan, and they were staying in this upstairs room. So that's upstairs, it has no door, and that's where they were staying. And then if we just go back to the stairs, there's 2 rooms in that. Theo was in the entrance room at the front, and then there was another room at the back with 2 bunks in there. We don't know very much about what Theo was doing in Byron between the Wednesday afternoon when he arrived and the Friday night when he disappeared. On the Wednesday, we think Theo might have walked to Woolworths on Johnson Street because we know that he searched for directions there on Google, and there is a bank transaction there for $17. The reason I say we think he may have walked is because it's possible he took the shuttle bus and was just keeping track because he tended to do that. A traveller called Marlon remembers seeing Theo when they caught the bus in to Byron together. She noticed him because of what he was wearing. She said that she saw him at some stage preparing food alone in the kitchen. We've also conceived from Theo's bank transactions that on the Thursday afternoon, that's the 30th of May, there was transactions at Woolworths and at Palace Cinemas. So we think that he might have seen a movie. Based on times, we think maybe Godzilla 2 or Top End Wedding, but we don't know which. And then presumably he got some food from Woolworths on his way home. There's no evidence that Theo really met anyone or spoke to anyone in Byron Bay between the Wednesday and the Friday. The people we spoke to from his dorm remembered that he was lying on his bed a lot and watching movies on his phone. They said he was friendly and he didn't seem unwell or tired, but he was just mostly lying on the covers watching movies on his phone. We don't have any evidence that Theo visited any of the sites of Byron. We found some tourist pamphlets located in his luggage, and I'll show you on those pictures of those pamphlets. But we don't know if he did any of those things, and there's no record in his bank transactions that he did. There's no records that he bought or consumed any alcohol on the Wednesday or Thursday. There's also no records to suggest that he hired a surfboard or a bike, and surfboards and bikes were available from the hostel, and Theo had talked about going surfing in Byron, but it doesn't seem like that happened. Theo told his sister that he was tired in a text on the morning of Friday the 31st of May, and we think that's probably because he'd been up quite late the night before until about 12:30, chatting with a friend on Facebook and on the phone. But probably by the Friday night, Theo was quite well rested. He hadn't met anyone or spoken to anyone or done much. So it's possible that he was even just a bit bored and ready to meet and go out and meet other people. I'm going to come now just briefly to some of the rumours and speculation that have surrounded Theo's disappearance. Many of those rumours revolve around the role that sex, drugs or parties might have played in Theo's disappearance. Part of the role of this opening and this inquest is to identify what evidence actually exists to support or discredit some of these theories. Much has been made in the media about Byron's international reputation as a place to party, to take drugs, and famous parties called doofs or beach doofs or bush doofs. Your Honour, the picture that those assisting you have got in this investigation is quite different. I'm not saying that this reputation doesn't exist. I'm not saying that doofs don't happen. But we tried to speak to backpackers that Theo had interacted with as part of this investigation. We understood that they might be nervous about talking about drugs or wanted to downplay drug use, but we assured them that Your Honour didn't want people to get in trouble. And we also asked a lot of general questions about reputation or others so people didn't feel like we were focusing on them. The weight of the evidence is that the backpackers that Theo met were happy to drink alcohol if it wasn't too expensive, but not that interested in drugs or even really aware that Byron Bay had any particular reputation related to drugs. That wasn't something that they were aware of. I think one of them had heard of Nimbin as being a town connected to marijuana. None of them had heard of doofs or parties being held on Tallows Beach. Of course, parties do happen on Tallows Beach, and it's entirely possible that someone talked about Tallows Beach parties in front of Theo, but we don't have any evidence of that, or even any evidence that anyone who Theo spoke to knew that that was a thing that happened at Tallows. In fact, one backpacker that we spoke to said that that sounded great, a party with a fire at Tallows, and she was sad that she didn't know that that was a tradition before she left Byron. What was overwhelming with all the people that we spoke to who interacted with Theo was the importance of the Cape Byron Lighthouse. That was the thing that they all nominated that they wanted to do while they were in Byron. They wanted to go see the lighthouse. They wanted a picture or a selfie there, ideally at sunrise or sunset. The lighthouse was advertised on the Greyhound bus that Theo used. It was the #1 spot on TripAdvisor, and the hostel had shuttle buses that went there at dawn during weekdays. They also hired out bikes so that people could ride there. We know that Theo was in his room on the Thursday, that's the 30th, when his dorm mates had been to the lighthouse, and we know that they were talking about it in front of him. Having said that, we don't actually have any evidence that Theo had any particular interest in the lighthouse. That pamphlet is the only evidence we've got of that. He didn't speak to his friends and family about that being a particular location he was interested in. We've gone through his digital camera to see if there are any photos of Byron Bay, and we haven't found any. So the only evidence we have as to sightseeing that Theo might have conducted in Byron is a photo he sent Emma on the 30th of May. So just to explain, the photograph on the top is the photograph that Theo sent Emma, and they had a text exchange, and we've translated it roughly as the text saying, "I've been to the beach and I've been for a walk. It was today during my walk, and the beach where I walk is the one on the left." We don't know exactly where that picture was taken, but we think it might have been taken from Fisherman's Lookout, which is an area at the pass where one can climb up a great deal of steps and then look down and have a panoramic view. I'm just going to show you, Your Honour, where that is on the map. So that's just there, Your Honour. And the other photo that I showed Your Honour was just a photo taken by the assisting team to demonstrate that we think it's a similar location. That's on the walk. If one was to take the famous lighthouse walk, that would take, that continues up to the lighthouse. So it's possible that Theo did walk up there on the Thursday, but we don't know. And we don't know when he says that the beach that he was walking on is the one to the left, whether he means the immediate left, which is Clark's Beach.
On ne sait pas si il montre la photo sur la À gauche?
Could I just ask the translator, you've just come off mute.
No. Yes. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you in the court. If you could place your microphone on mute.
Okay. I just lost connection.
Can you hear, Sil?
It might be a convenient time to pause, Your Honour.
All right, we might just take a short break now, just to make sure this is working well.
that Theo disappeared. We don't know and haven't been able to uncover what Theo did in the morning. At 5:14 p.m, there's a bank transaction at Woolworths on Johnson Street. And this is important, Your Honour, because that means that it's the third transaction at Woolies, which is in the centre of Byron Bay. Now, we don't know if Theo walked or took the shuttle bus every time. Either way, it means he's got some basic understanding of the geography of Byron Bay and how to get there from the hostel. If he's walked 3 times, he would have a good understanding of how to walk from town to back. On the Friday night, Theo went to a barbecue at the back terrace of the Wake Up Hostel. We'll see that today, Your Honour. The barbecues were popular with the guests, but no one remembers seeing Theo until the one on the Friday night. That Friday night was a really cold night. It was unusually cold for Byron Bay. There was a minimum of 9 degrees, but there was also an icy wind that made it feel a lot colder. In fact, one of the travellers, and it was a traveller from Britain, told us she was so cold she was wearing tracksuit pants under her clothes. That's a picture of the terrace at the Wake Up Hostel. Your Honour can see there are picnic tables there. That hut was a hut where travellers could purchase alcohol, although it doesn't look like Theo did purchase any alcohol from there. And we're told, and we'll hear evidence about it this week, that night it was so cold that there were some heat lamps that were near some of the tables, and people were jostling to try and get the tables with the heat lamps because it was so cold. Theo met a fellow Belgian called Antoine van Latham at this barbecue. When Antoine arrived at the barbecue, Theo was already at a table chatting to somebody. But Theo and Antoine discovered that they were both from Belgium. They hit it off and they started chatting away in French. Now, Theo was competent in English. He could speak it fine, but he had a strong accent and he definitely felt more comfortable in French, so it was probably great for him to finally meet somebody where he could speak French fluently. During that conversation, Antoine and Theo decided to go get some wine from a bottle shop in the town at Byron Bay. It looks like Theo popped back to his room before they left because we have a record of an entry, and then Theo and Antoine took the shuttle bus and went to the Great Northern Hotel at Byron and brought a 2-litre cask of rosé. And that's Theo there just at the bottle shop where they bought the rosé. Antoine paid for the wine and Theo paid for an Uber back to the hostel. They got back just after 8, and we've looked at Theo's Uber records and it doesn't seem there were any other Uber trips in Byron Bay apart from this one. Theo sent a text to Emma in French at 8 p.m, so possibly while he was either in the Uber or just after he got out, saying something like, "I'm definitely going out tonight," and apologising if he was slow to reply later on. So either Antoine and Theo had decided that they would be going out onto the town, or Theo in his head had thought that that was what he wanted to do that night. When Antoine and Theo got back to the Wake Up Terrace, they were joined by people that Antoine knew. He was sort of the social linchpin of the group. He had friends from his earlier travels who were Sander, Sasha and Michael, and they were staying in different hostels but had come over to see Antoine. And then there were women that Antoine knew from the hostel, including 2 British women, Eden and Ellen, and 2 German women, Marlon and Annika. Antoine and Theo were very generous and said to everybody, "You can have some of our wine." Now, this has been an important part of the investigation because, as Your Honour can understand, it's really important to know if Theo was really affected by alcohol that night, and if he was, how much he'd had. The curiosity is that no one seems to have consumed much, if any, of this wine. They all called it goon, and they all told us it was awful. They said it was much worse than what they were used to in Europe, and so either they said they didn't want any wine, or they took a cup and they had a few sips and said, "Thanks, I won't have any more." Now, theoretically, this means that Theo could have had a large amount of a 2-litre cask, but no one there remembers him having a lot of wine and no one remembers him acting like he was affected by alcohol. The evidence suggests that Theo was never a big drinker. He didn't go in for binge drinking or regular drinking or heavy drinking, and he had some personal reasons for not wanting to do that. But occasionally he went out during his travels and had a few drinks on those nights. I think his family said they could only remember one night where he was hungover or really affected at all. So the travellers were talking amongst each other for between 9:35 and about 11 o'clock. We've spoken to them, and what they remember about Theo was that he was funny and friendly, but not loud or outgoing. At some point they decided, let's go into town, and so the group took 2 shuttle buses. There were 2 shuttle buses departing Wake Up Hotel, and they took those into town, arriving at about 9:25. Theo sat with Antoine on the bus, and he tells us there was a nice mood on the bus. It was noisy, happy, elevated, excited to go out. After a bit of a chat about where to go, the group decided to go to a famous backpacker bar called Cheeky Monkeys. And importantly, because I've just been talking about Woolworths, Cheeky Monkeys is basically opposite Woolworths and the Palace Cinemas, so in an area of Byron that we know Theo had been to at least 3 times before. The groups arrived there at about 9:35 p.m. It looks like Theo was doing that thing where he looked up where he was on the maps, because he looked up directions to Cheeky Monkeys before they arrived, but he also did that after they arrived and while he was inside Cheeky Monkeys. We're going to play some CCTV footage now from Cheeky Monkeys, and I'll point out while we're watching some key points of interest, and I hope the family's okay with watching the footage. This is the group arriving. Theo's walking next to Sander at this point. You're going to see in a moment Sander's sort of hopping around, and we think that's because it was quite cold and because of the wind. And those 2 girls with darker hair are Eden and Ellen. And Your Honour can see there that Theo seems to be holding, it might be a wallet or it might be his phone. I think it might be his phone. And then Your Honour, there's just a stumble there. We might try and play that again just briefly. And that's Antoine, the tall fellow with the hooded jacket, Your Honour. And what's going to happen is that they're going to go in and then they're going to come out again. And we haven't conclusively determined why, but we think there were cards which gave them half-price drinks, and they were getting those from the front because they were staying at Wake Up. And the bank transactions do show that one drink was half the price of another, and they were both the same thing, Carlton beer, so we think they got half-price drink cards. And Your Honour will see here that Theo's on his phone, and he might have been texting, it's not clear, but we haven't been able to find any message that was sent at around this time, but it might have been on WhatsApp. He'd also he'd sent a message before he left to his stepsister Emma saying, "I'm sorry if I'm slow to reply because I'm going out." So he'd sort of indicated to her that he wasn't expecting to be texting that night. Again, he's still looking at his phone at this point. So this is, I don't know if Mr. Harrington has a cursor, but I could just show you where there, if Your Honour can see that cursor, that's Theo sitting in a booth with his fellow travellers, and Antoine is sitting opposite him, and he's sitting, you can't see who he's speaking to, but he's speaking to Sander, and Sander tells us, and he'll give evidence this week, that they're having quite an animated conversation about European politics. And Sander said there was no sign whatsoever that Theo was drunk or affected by alcohol, and he doesn't see how anyone would be having that kind of conversation and being able to disguise it. And Your Honour can see there that he's just drinking a beer. The entire time he was at Cheeky Monkeys, he had 2 drinks, 2 schooners of Carlton Draft, and there's no evidence that he bought any other alcohol or had any spirits, and we haven't seen any footage of anyone giving him a shot or giving him any other alcohol as well. So he's about to sort of drain his beer here. And you can see he's sort of laughing and chatting. And then he, what we would call sculls, or drains the rest of that beer. It's possible he was playing some sort of drinking game, but none of the people that we've interviewed remember what that was about or if there was any drinking game. And then they moved to another area of the bar. And Your Honour will hear some more evidence about it this week, but there's a point at which Theo sort of became separated from the group he had arrived with because some girls grabbed the 2 British girls and took them off, and so they sort of went into different areas of the bar. And so there's a period of time where Theo was talking to other people and then by himself. This is a picture of the patrons dancing on the tables. That's actually the way it worked at Cheeky Monkeys. The dance floor had tables and people were expected to dance on them and encouraged to dance on them. So that's what happened every night at Cheeky Monkeys. And Your Honour, Theo's not in view now, but he's just coming in now. And he's holding a beer and he's dancing. And obviously he doesn't seem to have any issues with coordination or balance at that point. We might just briefly fast forward at this point, if we can. So this point here, Your Honour, where Theo's standing on the main table and he's dancing, different people see different things in this footage. Some of the investigating police see signs that Theo is intoxicated or affected by alcohol and is sort of swaying. Others have looked at this footage and said, well, that looks like someone dancing in a bar. And this is when he's on his second beer, Your Honour. That's probably... Yeah. The next footage we're going to show is of Theo going to the toilet at about 10:55. So that's going, Your Honour will see that he just clipped the corner as he's going around the corner, and again, some have suggested that might be signs of intoxication. Others say, well, it's a dark bar, it's an easy thing to do. And then that's Theo leaving, having no trouble with the corner on the way out. And it's shortly after this point, when after Theo left the toilet, that he was seen by a security guard. The security guard thought that he was swaying and he asked Theo to step outside. And what we're going to see is Theo and the security guard walking from the top near the bar outside towards the front. That's him there. It's him again. And again, he almost collides with someone there, but it doesn't indicate anything clear about his state. And this is when... So this is the security guard taking Theo outside at the top. He's being asked to stand on the cross to have his photo taken because he's being ejected. And Your Honour can see there he's talking to a man in the queue and using hand expressions like, I don't know what's going on. Police have spoken to that man. We understand he's being told there that he's being ejected and he can't come back. And this is Theo leaving, and Your Honour will see he's on his phone. And what happens at this point next is that Your Honour can see that he's walked in a line towards that pole, but he avoids the pole and doesn't hit it. And that's the last footage of Theo. Your Honour, I wanted to explain at this point, particularly for the benefit of people outside New South Wales, that the laws in New South Wales enforce responsible service of alcohol strictly, and it may have been enforced particularly strictly in Byron Bay at this particular time. Licensees can face large fines and can lose their alcohol licence if any intoxicated person is supplied alcohol on their premises. Some might say, well, why would you go to a pub if it wasn't to be affected by alcohol? But that's not the law in New South Wales. Bar owners and managers are encouraged by law enforcement officials and educational campaigns to be hyper-vigilant and to err on the side of caution. Security guards are trained to watch for signs of intoxication and have the discretion to assess whether someone is affected by alcohol. That process is far from scientific. It's not done on blood analysis or breath analysis or even on how much alcohol a person has purchased. This, of course, means that mistakes can be made. As Your Honour can see, the evidence as to whether Theo was actually intoxicated is ambiguous. He may have been affected, or it may just be that confusion and language issues were misinterpreted. In any event, Theo was ejected, and it was recorded on an incident sheet that the reason was that he was approaching intoxication. As Your Honour's seen, his photograph was taken and he was told he had to leave and he couldn't come back. We're going to look at this aspect of him and his ejection later in this week when a security guard at Cheeky Monkeys and the manager will give evidence. I can tell Your Honour that Theo's ejection on his own and without any chance to tell his friends has caused his family an enormous amount of distress. They feel that Theo wasn't affected and the ejection was without any basis. Theo didn't have contact details for anyone in the group except Antoine. They'd exchanged a Facebook details earlier in the day. And I should just explain here that the evidence this week will be there wasn't any plan for the group to leave together. They'd sort of been drifting off in different directions during the night and not everyone had said goodbye. None of them actually knew until the coronial investigation and the police investigation that Theo had been asked to leave. And almost universally their reaction was confusion because they said that Theo didn't seem drunk and they said to them others in the bar seemed much more drunk. I also want to say here, Your Honour, that there have been reported rumours that Theo did something wrong in Cheeky Monkeys, like he entered a forbidden area or maybe that he was mistaken for someone else who had previously caused trouble. Like the police, we have also reviewed the CCTV evidence and interviewed most of the staff at Cheeky Monkeys. There's no evidence to suggest this. There's also no evidence to suggest that Theo's drink was spiked at Cheeky Monkeys, although Your Honour would see it's not always clear enough to eliminate that as a possibility. But we also haven't been able to find any evidence to suggest that drink spiking was a common occurrence with male backpackers going to Cheeky Monkeys, and we've gone down a number of investigative avenues to try and find out more about that. I was going to suggest that we have a longer break now, Your Honour, and when we come back, we're going to go into the maps, and with the assistance of Mr Harrington, we're going to show Your Honour some of Theo's data trail after 11:03.
All right, well, we might have a break until 12 now.
Thank you.
Please all stand. Coroners Court has resumed.
Yes, Ms Edwards.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'm going to take Your Honour now to what I'm going to call the Google data trail. As I've explained, Theo's phone wasn't located, but his Google account, which exists in the cloud and was discovered by Theo's family, contained a trove of information, including his emails, searches he conducted, a notes app, maps that he consulted, locations that he visited, and some of his social media messages. We haven't been able to access Theo's Snapchat, Instagram or WhatsApp messages for various reasons, but some of his friends and family have provided the investigation with their end of those messages. Next week, Your Honour, we're going to have expert evidence about the Google and the phone data, including what we can and can't draw from it in terms of Theo's location. We will also examine how police investigators might be able to access this data faster to streamline missing persons investigations and potentially save lives. And Your Honour can see this kind of information, genuinely without exaggeration, could save lives. The Google data in this case has been transformative. If this data had not been found, we simply wouldn't know what Theo had done after leaving Cheeky Monkeys. And for reasons that I'll explain, some of what happens next would be hard to accept or seem implausible, but Your Honour has every reason to accept that this data trail, particularly between 11:03pm on the 31st and 12:05am on the 1st, as reliable and credible. So if we go to the map that I showed earlier, Your Honour, this map shows the route taken from Cheeky Monkeys to Tallows Beach. The yellow pins show where the phone's location has been logged by Google, either by the phone performing some sort of activity or by the location services. Up to 12:05, those pins are very accurate, with a possible deviation of only around 3 metres. In this part, I'm going to identify a series of questions which we think hold the key to Theo's disappearance. It all, though, could be distilled to one central question, which is this: was Theo alone and lost and trying to get back to his hostel, and did he somehow die by accident trying to do that? Or did he go to Tallows Beach for a reason, whether it was alone or with someone else, or did he come across someone while he was there? And if so, why? And what happened? The first question is, why did Theo walk to Tallows Beach? If he wanted to walk back to Wake Up, why did he walk in the opposite direction? But if he didn't want to walk back to Wake Up, why, shortly after leaving, did he search for Wake Up on his phone? There's a lot of evidence, Your Honour, that Theo was a competent navigator and had no trouble using Google Maps and had been using Google Maps throughout his trip. For someone like Theo, it would have been very easy to navigate using Google Maps from Woolworths back to the hostel, and in fact several of the travellers that night used Google Maps to get from Cheeky Monkeys back to the hostel. We also have him coming back 3 times from Woolworths. Now, we can't understand any reason why he would have had any trouble on this night. One theory is that he kept walking up Kingsley Street, which is the street that just after he leaves, which Your Honour saw when he was looking at the phone and just moved past the pole. Now, he might have felt a bit, having been asked to leave in that sort of fashion, he might have felt nervous or awkward going back and walking past them again. But Your Honour can see that there are points at which he could have just turned left, and then that would have taken him back to Johnson Street and to Woolworths, and he would have found it easy to get back home. But he didn't do that. He turned into Tennyson Street and he walked towards the Byron Bay recreation grounds. And if we just move in, we're just going to move in a bit at this point. If I could show you, Your Honour, that there's a curve in the road down at the corner of Tennyson and Marvel Street. At that point, I anticipate the evidence will be from Detective Parker that if one was to stand there at night facing the cricket ground, the cricket nets, on the left there's light and sound, and it's obvious that the Byron Bay Township is to your right. If Theo felt that he wanted his night to continue and he wasn't ready to go home, it would have been very easy for him just to move in that direction and maybe find another bar, maybe even meet up with some other travellers. But he didn't do that. He kept walking straight ahead, and that red dot just before we get to that point, the lighthouse picture, there is a sign to the lighthouse on Kingsley Street that he walked by, but we don't have any evidence that he was looking for the lighthouse, and he didn't search for the lighthouse on his phone. There's nothing on Theo's Google activity that suggests he was searching for Tallows Beach or Cosy Corner or the lighthouse. The only directions that he entered into Google were in relation to the Wake Up Hostel, although we do think that it's possible that he was using those directions as a way of just having a map of Byron Bay open, and then he could zoom in and zoom out and navigate throughout. The next question is, what was Theo doing at the cricket nets? And we'll zoom in a bit to the location where Theo was at the cricket nets. And what we've done there, Your Honour, is those yellow pins indicate activity that's been logged on the phone at this time and also the time in which that it's been logged on. Theo stopped at the cricket nets for about 7 minutes. Nearby this area is the Byron Bay Youth Activity Centre, which I think the locals call YAC, and it's also near the long-term campsite of at least one person. That person spoke voluntarily to the police, and he doesn't remember seeing or hearing anything of note on the 31st of May. Locals will also know that it's quite easy to cut through the bush at this point going straight ahead to reach Main Beach, and then if Theo did that, he could have just turned left and walked up to his hostel. But that route through the bush is not that easy at night. It is quite easy to hear the ocean at night, but that might not be a sufficient guide. There's evidence to suggest that the cricket nets can be a hangout for people at times, including people who sometimes take drugs, and that's been the source of some speculation that Theo might have met up with someone there. The Google activity suggests that what's being logged at this time is looking at the maps, and that's the only evidence we have. One theory that's been explored by police is that Theo was lost and confused and thought he was near the Cumberbund Swamp Nature Reserve. So if we just scan back, you will see there is this large expanse of green that is in the side of where if one was to walk towards Balongal. And so the theory is perhaps he thought he was somewhere near there. But that essentially would mean that he would be completely upside down. And those people who use Google would know there's a blue dot which will show you which way you're going. And so it would be a very significant and unusual mistake to think that you were in that direction there if you were competent in using Google Maps like Theo was, and you'd have to ignore the blue dot on Google as well. It's very difficult to see how this mistake could be made unless Theo was seriously affected by alcohol or by something of that nature. Community members have written to Your Honour and pointed out that if Theo met a person at the cricket nets at this point, it might explain why he was there for 7 minutes, and it might also explain what he did next, which was to go to the start of the Milne track. What they say is if a person at the cricket net suggested that Theo go to Tallows Beach, maybe for one of the famous beach parties, or even if Theo asked someone there for directions to Tallows Beach, a search on Google would suggest going to the Milne track route. We know that Theo didn't search for Tallows Beach on Google, but we don't know if someone else did, and we also don't know if there was someone at that location who had local knowledge as to how to get to Tallows Beach. And at this point, Your Honour, it might be suggested, well, can't you ask Google, did anybody else at that location or at that time Google Tallows Beach? And that request has been made by those assisting Your Honour. We've had a series of conferences with national and multinational data providers, including Google, Facebook, Telstra, and also the phone manufacturer Oppo. All of these groups have been extremely helpful and they have donated their time voluntarily. They have all asked us to pass on their sympathy and condolences and understanding of the pain of Theo's family. But in terms of data, that's as far as it goes. Google will not provide the data relating to other users voluntarily, and Your Honour has no power to require it. As Your Honour also knows, Theo's disappearance was investigated in Europe as well as in Australia. The assisting team has met with the Belgian investigators and with the Belgian magistrate who coordinated the European investigation. Unlike Australian authorities, the Belgian authorities were able to access technology called geofencing. That can identify if other phones were geolocated near certain locations at certain times. Those inquiries were conducted by the Belgian investigators, and they didn't identify any phones in the close vicinity of Theo's route when he was around the cricket nets. Now, I'm just doing this right now from the bar table because, Your Honour, we hope to have a statement, or better still, live evidence from a Belgian investigator to explain this to us in terms of what they did, how they did it, and how many points they searched for. We also wanted to know, does that exclude all phones, or does it include only phones with a Google account? And does it include all iPhones? Because we understand there's an issue with accessing the Apple network, but we don't know if that's all Apple phones or whether Apple phones with a Google account will still be picked up. We haven't been able to get that statement or a witness because the Belgian authorities, and I'm not being critical of them, the Belgian authorities require a certain multinational legal process called relating to the Multilateral Assistance Treaty, or MLAT, to occur to participate in this inquest. We tried to access that process and initiate it through the Commonwealth Attorney Generals, but that is not a process that's available for a missing persons coronial investigation. As we have explained to the family, we haven't given up, and we are still pursuing trying to get a Belgian investigator to explain this evidence to Your Honour. But right now we are stymied legally because we can't access that treaty. I expect that's a matter where Your Honour may make some recommendations in due course, because clearly it's an unacceptable situation that we can't get access to what could be critical information about what was happening that night. If I move now from the cricket nets to Theo's route after that point, Theo took a route to the start of the Milne track which is not in any way intuitive, nor is it clearly signposted with any signs at the location. So I might just we'll try and see if we can sort of show Your Honour using a cursor the route that Theo took. So he walks across the cricket nets, and he walks up a street. At various points he's looking at maps, which is also depicted on this map. And then he reaches here, which is the start of the Milne track. And I can indicate Your Honour has done this walk along suburban streets, and it's not something that one would come across intuitively. The complexity of this route has been a focus of theories that Theo must have had someone to guide him, or at the least received very specific directions. Later on in the inquest, we're going to look more closely at Theo's map activity around this time and see whether it is possible that he could have navigated there himself if he was alone. But this takes us to the start of the Milne track and pose the question, could it really be the case that Theo decided to walk down this dark track alone and at night? And if I could just put on the record at this stage that Your Honour knows this track because about a year ago, Your Honour walked it once during the day and once at night with conditions similar, but albeit not identical in terms of the moonlight, so we could replicate the darkness as much as possible. Those assisting Your Honour were bombarded at an early stage from the police, family and many locals. Everyone said it was essential that Your Honour walk this track at night to understand just how strange it would be for a foreigner to walk alone down this track at night. Detective Parker, the officer in charge, was with us that night, and I expect he will tell us next week that it was dark and it was frightening. It's spooky, Your Honour. There's almost no moonlight, and there's very little light from houses. There's a beam from the lighthouse that goes by about every 15 seconds, but that doesn't provide any actual illumination. the police recorded at an early stage in an investigator's log that it's very hard to understand why anyone would take this route alone or at night. Should we move to the photo now?
Yes, right.
I'm just going to show a photo. That's the picture of the lighthouse, the picture of the sign to the lighthouse, Your Honour, that he walked by that night, but we don't know if he saw it, but he didn't take that route. That's the Google directions. I'll just go back there for a second. That's the Google directions. If one were to put Tallows Beach in from the cricket nets, one would be able to access the start of the Milne track. That's the start of the Milne track during the day. I remember a community submission, we took that photo from them because it depicts the scene during the day. And then I'll show you a photo at night. That's the assisting team, Your Honour, walking the track during that view. That photo, I think, illustrates well how much one is dependent on torchlight for that process. There is just no other light, and it's completely in darkness otherwise. And that's significant because Theo's family point out that if he's using his Google Maps and he's also got his torchlight on, and at various points he's using other apps, it's hard to understand how he could still have battery life until the afternoon on the Saturday. And that's another reason why they query perhaps Theo was with someone who had a torch or had some access to a torchlight. So if we go back to the map, it might take a few seconds to load. The evidence suggests that Theo was walking very quickly or even jogging at the point at which he first entered the Milne track. Some have suggested that that was because he was frightened by the dark or just wanted to get there quickly. Others think it's evidence that he might have been guided with someone with local knowledge who would have been able to walk with greater confidence and he could have followed on with them. However, we have to be a bit careful with walking speeds because some of the location coordinates on the map are less accurate. Some of them are outliers. So, for example, there's one at 11:24 where the accuracy is within 104 metres. There's another one at 11:34 where the accuracy is within 45 metres. So, if those were taken into account, that will inflate the distance that Theo has travelled, meaning that will increase his calculated walking speed. Even though if those are taken into account, he's still walking at quite a speedy pace in the dark at night at this particular point in time. The next question is, why did Theo turn off the track at a location, or just before a location that I'm going to call the crossroads? And what I mean by the crossroads, Your Honour, is there's a part of the track where it's like a cross and there's a pathway that moves to left to right and there's another pathway that goes straight ahead. But before that point, Theo left the Milne track and he moved onto a wide fire trail, and that's not surprising of itself because it's quite easy to miss the Milne track and the fire trail is more obvious, particularly at night. But the crossroads area, before Theo reached that point, he turned off. And I'll just show you, Your Honour, you'll see at 11:38 there's a reference to Theo using his camera. So what we know is at this point Theo has left a well-marked fire trail and he's plunged into dense bush. Now, first, if Theo was, as some people think, on his own and lost and trying to get back to the wake-up hostel, that was a tragic mistake, because if he'd just kept walking straight, he would have come across Tallows Beach Road, which to the right is the car park, but to the left goes back up to Lighthouse Road, and then he would have found it very easy to make his way back into town. And that's probably the most intuitive route at that point as well. We don't know why he turned right without a clear track and plunged into bushland, which is extremely steep and heavy going. There's various theories at this point about why he did that. One theory is that he could hear the ocean and he was tired of walking in the bush at night and just decided to try and take a shortcut to move towards the sound of the ocean. It's hard to test what the sound of the ocean was that night. It was windy and the surf was reasonably big, but there's no way of replicating those exact conditions. Another theory is that Theo was with someone who had local knowledge and they suggested that they veer right at that point. Another theory is that Theo was avoiding someone or something. We've taken a close look at the camera activity at this particular point, and it may be significant that he seems to have used his camera. We even wondered whether or not he'd seen something like an echidna or a nocturnal animal and had sort of followed it off into the bush, but that's pure speculation. What's important to understand is that he's gone from a very easy, normal walking path to something that's genuinely difficult to navigate through, and it's very hard to understand why he would do that. He also lost his cap at this phase in the walk, and Your Honour can see that red dot there where he lost his cap. And that's significant because it means that either he couldn't find it when it came off his head, or he's decided for whatever reason not to go back and look for it. And Theo's family tell us that this is important because it was a favourite cap of Theo's and he was protective of all his possessions. But he also had the cap, he used it to keep his long hair out of his face, and it was a windy night. So Lisa says that it would have really annoyed him to have his hair blowing around in his face. So they think there must have been some reason that stopped him or prevented him from going back to look for the cap and to find it, and they think that that's something that tends towards Theo being with someone at this point, maybe someone who hurried him along. There's also a strangeness to the path that's taken from the point at which he uses his camera to the point he uses the beach. Your Honour can see that there's quite an unusual deviation where he goes down and up and around. Some of the members of the community say that he might have done this to avoid a long-term camp that's in this area of the bush. He's basically given the camp a wide berth around. They surmise that Theo either saw the camp or saw some lights from the camp, or he was with someone who knew the camp was there and knew a route to avoid it. Others have suggested that just the overall strangeness of the route is a sign that Theo was either very drunk or affected by drugs, having either consumed them voluntarily or had his drink spiked or something of that nature. But I don't think there's any controversy that this is a strange, almost inexplicable, difficult route that he took at this point from 11:38 until he reaches the beach. Theo's family have pointed out that when Theo got to the beach at Tallows, he's walked towards Cosy Corner, but he's taken the unusual route of walking nearer the soft sand on the dunes and well away from the waves. It wouldn't have been obvious that night where the actual edge of the water was because of the darkness, but as can be seen there, he's, give or take 3 metres, he seems to be very much into the soft sands of the dunes. And they've wondered again whether he's with someone who suggested that they take that route, or whether he's hiding from someone or something on the beach. Although, as I'll go on to say later, there's nothing in his messages that he sends later on that suggests that he had any frightening experience or was hiding from anyone at that point. So I'll take you now, Your Honour, to Cosy Corner, which is at the end of Tallows Beach in this sort of area here. And there may have been some shelter from the wind at this point. But something unusual happens at this point, which is just before midnight at 11:56. Theo left the beach and, well, at least Theo's phone, which we believe was still in Theo's possession at this point, left the beach and walked upwards. And the bushland around here is very hard going. This was not a natural path or anything that could have been navigated easily. He's done that for some time. From start to return, this trip took about 8 minutes, and we've pulled out what activity has been logged by the phone at those points, and we've also indicated the time at which that occurred. A number of members of the community have written to Your Honour suggesting various theories as to what was happening at this point. One is that Your Honour can see the road that goes up to the lighthouse at this point. It's been suggested that Theo might have seen or heard cars and thought that if he just went straight up, he could reach the road. Others have thought that he might be trying to reach the path back to the Tallows Beach car park, which we can see is just depicted there, and is quite a well-marked trail that he's not at that point of it, but that trail itself can be seen on Google on a zoom in. But if he was doing that, one wonders why he wouldn't walk a bit further back. Some have suggested that he might have been looking for a sheltered place to stay, maybe to wait for sunrise and dawn so he could take a photo of the lighthouse, which is because those pictures are quite prized. But again, his family points out he didn't like the cold. It's very unlikely he's going to stay the night in a really cold place to do that. Others have suggested that there might have been a party or some other event in the bush that he was looking for, or somebody was with him and saying this is where the party is. Some have suggested that he was hiding from someone or something, although again, I'll come to his messages later. Others have suggested he was looking for a place to use the toilet, although if it was private, he may not have needed to go that far. And finally, there's been some suggestions that he was using Grindr, but I can categorically rule out that Theo didn't have that app, and he didn't have any app like that, so that can be discredited completely. Now, at 12:05 a.m, the location services were switched off on Theo's phone, and I expect the evidence will probably suggest that Theo did this himself, maybe to save his battery life. But we have another location point at 12:56 a.m, which might mean that location services were briefly turned on again. There's a location data entry in Google here on Lawson Street, and this may seem surprising because that would suggest that in that 50 minutes Theo has left Cosy Corner and gone to the other side of the headland. But that location point has to be treated with great caution. I expect the expert evidence will say, on balance, Theo was probably still at Cosy Corner at this point, because this location point is based on cellular data, not GPS, so the accuracy is only plus or minus 2,000 metres. So all we can really draw from that is that Theo's within 2,000 metres of that point, and that would take him, that's consistent with him still being at Cosy Corner. Now, I've mentioned a few times that Theo sent some messages after 12:05. He sent a message to Emma after earlier saying in the night that he was going to take a time to reply. He also had a light exchange in French on Facebook Messenger with his friend Lou Gaimori, and the message was about you two coming to have a concert in Australia, and he laughed, and she asked if he was going to stay because it was in September, and they were joking about how he was going to miss it because he was going back to Belgium. She's going to give evidence about this exchange this week, but her evidence will be that she thought that that was Theo who was in French, and it was the sort of conversation that she felt was consistent with him, and she personally holds no doubts that it was from him. Theo also seems to have watched a clip on a French quiz show on YouTube. It's a show called Burger Quiz, and Mr. Harrington, who speaks French, showed some of it to me, and it's a bit like QI is the closest I can describe it. Theo also searched maps, and there's a log of a search for hotels in Byron Bay, and we'll go into more detail next week where we'll interrogate more closely the phone data at this time. There's one thing I want to put on the record now, Your Honour, and that's it's widely been reported that Theo's phone engaged in a handshake with a mobile device at around this time. There is evidence that Theo's phone briefly connected to an IP address from the Telstra service just before 1 a.m, but we have no evidence that Theo was near a mobile device at this time. And we've spent some time trying to dig into why this fact has been so widely reported, but we haven't been able to understand what the source of that fact is. But there is no evidence that Theo's phone engaged in a handshake with a mobile device. The Belgian authorities also examined if any phone was geolocated at around this time, but again, we have very scant information about what that process actually involved, and we're still chasing a statement or evidence to find out more about what that could include and exclude. This takes us to 1:02 a.m. Your Honour, something happened at 1:02 a.m, and if we knew what that was, we think we probably would know what happened to Theo. Theo's phone stopped receiving data at this time from the Telstra phone towers, either because it suddenly became out of range or was blocked from range, or because it was switched off or put into flight mode. At 6:17am, the phone started receiving data again. What this means is that the phone, at least, didn't go into the water, because it's been confirmed by the phone manufacturer that the phone wouldn't stop receiving data if it was submerged in water and then come back on again, having had that process. The working theory of the police is that what happened at this point was that Theo decided around this time to walk up the grassy side of the cliffs to reach the road or to reach the lighthouse, and perhaps dropped his phone and went to retrieve it and then fell and was swept out.
When you say about this time, you're referring to?
So we don't know really where Theo was after 12:05, because that's the last reliable data point. We just know that he's within 2,000 metres of Cosy Corner, of that last data point on Lawson Street. However, we do know that he's texting with Emma up to a point at 12:55. So unless he's texting as he's walking, the police theory, and as I say, it's a working theory, is that at some time around that point and before 1:02, Theo's decided to walk up this side. And that area of the cliffs is very dangerous, because during the day it looks deceptively easy to walk up from Cosy Corner to the lighthouse. And when I say deceptively easy, and particularly in the context of this week being Schoolies Week, Your Honour, I want to make clear it's a very dangerous thing to do, and many bad things have happened to people who have tried to do it. So I'm not saying it's easy in a safe sense, but people during the day are known to walk up that area, and then they can walk up the ridge line and reach the lighthouse. And that's a depiction looking down, which shows that what looks like an easy side with grass on the right turns into a steep shale area. And if anyone was to walk on the steep shale area, it's extremely unstable and it would be easy to fall. Your Honour would notice I keep saying during the day, because at night it's completely different. There is no obvious path, and it's not something that would naturally suggest itself for a person to do at night. And that's the difficulty with the police working theory, and Detective Parker acknowledges, he understands and accepts that that's the thing that's hard to accept about the working theory, which is it's obviously dark and it's dangerous. And Theo's family feel it's completely inconsistent with the person that they know and with his character that he would do something like that. And they say the only way they can think that he would do something like that is if someone else was with him and assuring him that it was safe and that it was easy, because it's not something they can ever see him attempting on his own. The reason that, to some extent, the police favour this theory is it would explain why nothing has been recovered in relation to Theo, because if he did fall at this point, it's possible that his body could be washed away without any remains being recovered. There are 2 reported cases where that has happened at Cosy Corner. In 1989, a police officer called Andrew Murray disappeared. He tried to rescue a swimmer who was in distress. Constable Murray went out on his surf ski and just disappeared, and despite extensive searches he was never found. In 2018, an Irish surfer called Stuart Butler disappeared. He and 2 friends had gone swimming at Cosy Corner. They got caught in a rip, and in that case a rescue effort was launched almost immediately. While they were still in the water, people were going out to rescue them. It included helicopters and the use of coloured dye in the water, but still Mr Butler had never been located again. So that's the police theory. I want to go back to the phone resuming signal at 6:17am, because obviously if Theo fell, he can't have been with his phone. So either he's gone to retrieve it and not been able to get it, or something else has happened. There's going to be a lot of evidence next week about that, because we see that as the core of this case. but I expect the evidence will be that as a phone signal and battery become weaker, it is possible to have a blackout like that for about 5 hours where the phone stops connecting to the tower, and there's a number of different explanations as to why that would be, and it doesn't require anything like a fall from cliffs or a dramatic change in altitude. It could happen from mild environmental changes like a person sitting on the phone while it was in their back pocket, or something environmental like dawn breaking, which did happen around 6:17, and light refracting off the water and affecting the signal in that way. And we're going to hear about that next week. I'm going to come now to the data we have for the last phone connection, and this has been a great focus of the police investigation because they concentrated their efforts on trying to find where Theo could last be found, and that's at 1:47 p.m. on Saturday the 1st of June. Should we bring that up on the map or wait for those? Wait for those, yeah. Theo's connected to a Telstra phone tower at the corner of Massenger and Patterson Street, and as I've said before, you could think on its own that that meant that he's gone to the other side of the headland, but great care needs to be taken in using cell tower connections to correlate that with the location of a phone. So we've undertaken some further analysis using timing advance data, which has been done with the assistance of Telstra. This uses the maximum distance in metres of a phone from a cell tower. The location of the phone can be roughly estimated by using an arc of that distance around the tower. So I'm going to show you on a map. The shaded area is an arc showing the maximum distance of the phone from the tower at 12:05. So that's when we know that Theo's phone was at Cosy Corner. That's 1,717 metres from the tower. There's no way of knowing in which direction that is, but what we do know is that because we know that at 12:05 the phone was at Cosy Corner, we know that that's accurate, but that the phone was at the absolute outer edge of that maximum, almost exactly where the curve of that line is. That's at 12:05. If we look at the same data at 6:17 a.m, the distance from the phone tower is greater. It's 2,108 metres. Now, if everything was moving in a perfect, even constant, then that would suggest that the phone has gone further away from the tower, and if it was still on the edge, it would be on the other side of the cliffs. But there's no reason to think that it's even and constant. There are so many variables about this process that one can't draw that inference. There's going to be a lot of evidence next week about searches of the cliffs, including one that Your Honour ordered to try and once again look for the phone in October this year. But what we want to make clear is that while this photo is not inconsistent with the phone falling from the cliffs, there's so many variables in terms of environmental changes that could also explain the difference in that data, including dawn, sunlight, changes in tides and changes in atmospheric condensation. All of these variables affect the accuracy of the timing advance data. And then the final data that we have looked at is cell tower connection points. Theo's phone bounced off different cell towers after midnight, including the Ballinasset Tower, but it never connected to the Lighthouse Tower. And there have been some submissions made to Your Honour that if Theo had climbed upwards to the cliffs, it would be expected that his phone would start bouncing off the Lighthouse Tower. And again, we'll hear expert evidence about this next week, and we'll also hear about an abseiling experiment the police did where they took Oppo phones and abseiled down the cliffs to see if they could replicate the data from Theo's phone and see where those phones were connected from. I expect that the expert next week will say it's just too difficult to draw any safe inferences from those sorts of experiments about locations. And this is a particularly challenging area to draw inferences because triangulation isn't possible, and this is an uneven geographical area surrounded by water on a headland, and we have a phone with a weak signal and a declining battery. And each one of those factors individually can affect the reliability of cell tower locations. Combined, it's very difficult to draw any safe inference at all. So I wanted to go through that as an overview, Your Honour, but obviously the expert evidence is the key evidence in this case, and we'll deal with that next week. I'm moving now just to the last portion of my opening, which is relating to Theo being reported missing. Theo was reported missing by his family in both Queensland and Byron Bay when he didn't arrive in Melbourne on the 6th of June 2019. Theo's mother had been increasingly worried about him being out of contact since the 1st of June, but thought that he might be in an area without mobile reception. And she'd been sort of following his activity on Facebook, and she could see that he wasn't active after the 1st of June. Theo was also reported missing by the Wake Up Hostel on the 6th of June after staff examined his belongings and found his passport. Prior to the 6th of June, the hostel staff had called Theo, left voicemail messages for him, sent him an email, left notes on the door of the dorm room and asked people in the room about where he might be. But because Theo was not reported missing until the 6th of June, the 72-hour period, which is well known and regarded to be critical in terms of missing persons investigations, that time had already passed. Your Honour will hear evidence from the former and current manager of the Wake Up Hostel this week. I expect they'll tell Your Honour that it's very common for backpackers to disappear without checking out, and often they leave belongings behind, and it's really hard to work out what are those belongings when they're sharing a dorm room with lots of people. But I expect they'll also say that it's very rare for a traveller to leave valuable items like a camera or a passport behind, and both were left behind in Theo's case. I can indicate that Your Honour proposed a new protocol to speed up missing persons investigations to police by hostels, particularly if travellers disappear without contact and leave their passport or valuable belongings behind. Your Honour's proposal has the support of the Wake Up Hostel and the New South Wales Police, and will now be seeking the involvement of the New South Wales Backpackers Operated Association, BOA, for their consideration as to whether it should be adopted across New South Wales. Your Honour will notice that I haven't spent much time discussing the police investigation and the searches which were conducted for Theo after he was reported missing. That's going to be the subject of next week's evidence, and I'll do a short overview on Monday before we hear from Phil Parker, who's the Detective Sergeant who was in charge of the investigation. We'll hear from the search coordinators, Officers Papworth and Vidler. We'll hear from officers who worked with Telstra to analyse phone data, and we'll hear from our own data expert, Professor Senavaratne. We will also hear from the current head of the Missing Person Registry, Detective Inspector Glenn Brown. His evidence will include changes since Theo went missing to police protocols to expedite obtaining CCTV evidence and new technological tools used by police to search for missing persons. He will also address some of the barriers faced by police in gaining speedy access to data and explain why police can't automatically or easily access the Google data of every person who's reported missing. That may also be a focus of some more evidence we'll hear later. Finally, next week we'll hear about the extraordinary efforts of the Byron Bay community, who came together in an overwhelming response to search for Theo. Byron Bay volunteers not only scoured the beaches and the bushlands, leading, for example, to the successful location of the camp, but they blanketed trees and poles around the region with posters of Theo, and that's an illustration of one of those posters, Your Honour. The community offered compassionate and valuable assistance to Theo's family as they endured the unspeakable agony and uncertainty of their young son disappearing in a foreign country. I understand that support continues to this day. We will also hear from Theo's family and loved ones, including JP and Theo's parents, about their experiences in searching for Theo and what it's like for the loved ones of a foreign national to navigate an unfamiliar police and coronial system. At the end of this opening, I'll tender the 11-volume brief of statements, maps, records, photos and data. I can indicate that Your Honour will conduct an informal view today with the assisting team of the Wake Up Hostel, Cheeky Monkeys and the approximate route walked by Theo after leaving Cheeky Monkeys. This won't be an official part of the coronial proceedings, but it may refresh Your Honour's memory of the key geographical features that we saw last year when we did that walk. That's the opening. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you very much, Ms Edwards. We're going to adjourn now.
Sorry, Your Honour, I think both Ms Palmer and Mr Evenden were hoping to say a few words before we adjourn.
Oh, certainly. Mr Evenden.
Thank you, Your Honour. I'll just make the briefest of opening remarks, Your Honour.
Yes.
Thank you to Councillor Sisting on behalf of the family for her comprehensive opening. Theo's family, Your Honour, have come here hoping to get answers about what happened to Theo, and they understand that could be a long process. They feel strongly supported by members of the Byron Bay community, support which has come on so many different levels since it first became clear that Theo was missing. They remain concerned, Your Honour, that there are people in the community who may know more about Theo's disappearance or have valuable information that may explain what happened to him. They themselves do not know what happened to Theo, and despite the investigation so far, many questions remain and answers remain distant. There's been much work done, Your Honour, already by New South Wales Police and those assisting, Your Honour, to investigate Theo's disappearance. The family is hopeful that more resources will be put into that investigation and that other possible scenarios will be pursued, alternative scenarios, Your Honour, to the police theory. They believe there would be value in specialist missing persons investigators from New South Wales Police becoming involved in the investigation, conducting an independent review of results so far and assessing the need for future inquiries. Theo's family want to be sure every possible scenario is investigated with no stone left unturned.
Yes, thank you, Mr Evenden. Completely understand. Ms Palmer, do you want to come up to the bar table?
Briefly approach the bar table.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. I'm going to approach the bar table but then turn towards the family because this statement is really directed towards you. The Commissioner of Police, on behalf of the New South Wales Police Force, would like to extend his condolences to the Hayez family in connection to the tragic disappearance of Theo. Every disappearance is a tragedy, but the disappearance of a young person on the cusp of adulthood with so much of their life yet to live is particularly devastating. On average, 28 people go missing every day in New South Wales. Most people are located almost immediately. However, around 1% go on to become long-term missing persons, a term which describes persons missing for more than 90 days. Sadly, Theo now falls within this group. In July 2019, the New South Wales Police launched the revitalised Missing Persons Registry and completely overhauled its standard operating procedures to improve its ability to locate missing persons. The Commissioner welcomes this important review by the Coroner, particularly with respect to possible improvements to the current legislative framework in that it may assist police to carry out their investigations in the future. Finally, the Commissioner would like to note the role and contribution of each of the officers and volunteers who have contributed to the search for Theo. Some of these efforts have been extraordinary. Otherwise, all of our thoughts are with Vinciane, Laurent, Lucas, Jacqueline, Jean-Philippe or JP, Julia, Michael, Lisa, Matthew and the broader Hayez family, many of whom have travelled long distances to be with us today.
Thank you very much, Ms Palmer. Unless there's anything else, we'll adjourn for today and resume at 10 a.m. tomorrow.